All right, very welcome to our 2021 Assessments Q&A webinar for GRESB Infrastructure. My name is Katie. I sit on the member relations team as an associate infrastructure. I'll be talking through some of the changes that we have made to our 2021 assessments this year. We'll start with that, and afterwards we'll have some of the questions that came in beforehand via our Q&A type form, and then we'll have an open Q&A session. Throughout the session, you can ask any of your questions using the Q&A button, and we'll try to address as many as we can. And if not, we will try to answer your questions afterwards. So feel free to already start asking questions. We won't get to that straight away, but we'll do that in a moment. So let's start off. So our agenda, as I said, we'll talk about the key assessment changes, but not before we do a short introduction to the GRESB infrastructure team. So these are the people that you might already know if you've participated in our assessments before, but there are also some new faces. So it's always good to have a reminder and to know who the people are behind the help desk that you might have been in touch with. After we talk about the assessment changes, we'll have the open Q&A session, and we'll also show you some of the resources that you can use throughout the GRESB reporting process. If you have any issues with hearing us or with any of the slides, please contact us in the chat function, and we'll have some people help you with that. So the Q&A button sits at the bottom of your screen, so you should be able to use that to ask any questions. So please don't use the chat function to ask questions. The Q&A function is a bit more helpful for us because then we can see the different questions and we can see which one have been answered already. So please use that one. So this is our team. So on the call today is obviously myself, Katie Greneman, but also on the call is Oriden. He will also be helping you with some of the questions throughout the session. David is our other member of the infrastructure team, but he's not here today. We also have Eric Landry. He's our climate change specialist, and he's the person you go to whenever you have any questions about resilience. And otherwise, we have Stephen Pringle, our Director of Member Relations, Roxana Isayu, our Chief Sustainability Officer, and Rick Walters, Chief of Standards and Innovation. So these are the people you go to when you have any questions, and they'll be happy to get to you on any specific topic. So let's talk about the 2021 infrastructure assessments. So just a quick recap of how our assessments are structured. So it's a little different if you're already familiar with the real estate assessment, but maybe not so very much with the infrastructure assessments. It's structured slightly differently. So we have the GRESB Infrastructure Fund Assessment for portfolios, comprising of a management component and a performance component. The management component is an assessment with lists of questions, and the performance component consists of the underlying assets that are owned in the portfolio. And the assets themselves complete the GRESB Infrastructure Asset Assessment, which consists of a management component and a performance component. Roughly speaking, the management component covers topics like leadership, management of ESG issues, whether the entity has policies in place, what it's doing to engage with stakeholders, and how it's managing its risks. The performance component is more quantitative and more data-oriented, and focuses for the asset assessment on things like your energy use, water consumption, but also diversity numbers and certification. So they're more the practical side of things. One change that happened this year is that for the infrastructure asset assessment, the management component is 40% of your overall GRESB score, and the performance component is 60%. So last year, that's 50-50. Now, the reason for that is that GRESB as a whole is shifting towards emphasizing performance throughout its assessments, and so this is part of that transition. So watch that space. In the fund assessment, the performance component comprises 70% of your GRESB score, and the management component 30%. So that's the recap on how our assessments are structured. So it's good to bear this in mind as we go through the Q&A, because we'll be covering both the fund and asset assessment. Obviously, some indicators are in both the fund and asset assessment. So if you have a question on those, we can kind of cover both of those. And some are more specific to one assessment or the other. So, but we'll try to cover both, and feel free to ask any questions about either. So one big thing that happened this year was the integration of the resilience module. So last year we had a standalone module that was in addition to the assessments, which covered topics on resilience and on your climate risk. And that was fully aligned with the TCFD. And as the TCFD becomes more and more important, we've integrated the resilience module into our assessment, so both on the real estate and infra side, so both the fund and asset assessment. And I'll show you what that looks like on a practical level. So they've been integrated into our existing aspects, the leadership and risk management aspects. Within the leadership aspect, they've been integrated into 2 existing indicators on the individual responsible for ESG and on the individual or the senior decision maker responsible for ESG. Now, those questions have been expanded upon, so the new parts of those questions on resilience won't be scored. The existing parts will be, the new parts won't be. On the risk management side, we've added 5 new indicators on resilience of strategy, transition risk identification and impact assessment, and physical risk identification and impact assessment. All of the new indicators won't be scored, and so you have a whole year to try out and to understand them and to integrate them into your reporting processes. But you can ask any questions you have on those during the session, and we will hopefully be able to cover those. As part of the resilience integration, in the asset assessment, we have a list of ESG issues that we cover, and we previously had 2 issues, climate change adaptation and resilience to catastrophe disaster. Those have been merged into 1 new issue, which is physical risk. So that simplifies things a little bit and is better aligned with the TCFD. Well, I hope that's all been a bit of a whirlwind. I've not gone into the nitty-gritty of the changes. There are obviously smaller changes throughout our assessments as well, but we just wanted to give you the main ones that are important for you to know as we go into the Q&A. So we'll start off with some pre-prepared questions. Like I said, you can use the Q&A function in the little button that you have in your little panel in Zoom. To ask any questions throughout. Feel free to ask whatever you have on top of mind and we'll try to answer it. But we'll start with a few pre-prepared questions. Aurelian, do you want to take the first question? Are you up for it?
Sure, I'm ready.
Great, go.
Okay, so the first question we have today is about access rights. And so a question we commonly get is, can any investor access my assessment results? So the short answer is no, but I'll give you a bit more detail in relation to that. So the assessment is entirely shared with only yourselves. That means that when there's 2 stages, there's an input stage and an output stage. And from the input stages, you typically have an account manager, but you may also have internal contributors that may help you fill in the assessment. And at the end of the reporting period, once we go for validation and scoring, you get an output typically around October. And so once you get your report, the report is entirely yourself. So only the people who have contributed to the assessment in the input stages will have access to it. Now, if an investor wishes to request access to your assessment, they need to request access. And then you have the option to either grant access or to revoke that access or do nothing. But until you actually grant access, the investor will never see your assessment results. So that's an important feature to take into account. Katie, is there a question on grace period after that, or should I delve into it now?
I think it's fine if you cover that now. I don't think we have a special slide on that, but that's maybe a nice little segue to go into. Yeah.
Okay, sure. So some of you may have heard about the grace period feature, and the grace period feature is essentially applicable to our first-year participants and first submissions. So you have the option when you start a whole new assessment to select what we call grace period. And the idea behind grace period is that investors will not be able to request access to your results. So that's the only distinction. It means that they can't, you will never have an investor who will be able to request that access through our platform during the first year. Now, typically we have this in place in case that, first-year participants will recognize that participation in GRESB can be a bit challenging, especially if you're at the start of your ESG journey, and that, maybe you do not wish to share your score or have any pressure from them. So that's what we enable. That's why we enable this feature. But if, for instance, you are very happy with your scores and you do wish to share them with investors or want investors to request access, to put this precisely, then you are able to do so. So you can lift the grace period, and hence investors will be able to request access. So hopefully that's clear in relation to investor access in relation to assessment results. Alternatively, what you can also do is be proactive, and we also have a feature whereby you can reach out to investor members and grant them access directly. So it's a two-dimensional sort of relationship. Investors can either request access, or you can enable access to investors.
Great, thanks, Aurelian. We have another question actually on access rights. Would you also be able to help answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have 4 different types of users on our platforms. So we've got account managers, investor relations managers, internal contributor, and external contributor. Now, what is an account manager? An account manager is typically the person who sets up an entity, whether it's a fund assessment or an asset assessment. And as you will see, they have a number of rights allocated to this user. So if he has the ability to edit responses in the assessment, to view other users, to invite other users, to change entity settings, upload documents, and so forth, but also grant investor access if necessary. So I also want to emphasize that we do not limit the amount of account managers. So you can invite other contributors who can also be account managers, so that you don't have to rely on one single person to manage the assessment. And typically, we find that many accounts or assessments have several account managers, or at least 2 or 3. Typically, when it comes to investor relations, as you can see, we have lower edit rights, so we drop off invite users and submit assessments. But if, for instance, you have a consultant, maybe you just want to have them as an external contributor, whereby they only see the input stages, but they don't see the output. And these different dynamics can be used flexibly any way you want. You can also change, as long as you're an account manager, the status of a user. So if, for instance, if someone's an investor relations manager and you want to change their rights to an external contributor, you can absolutely do so, and the other way around as well.
Great, thanks, Irene. That was very clear, very thorough. As I said, please feel free to use any questions using the open Q&A function. I haven't seen any come in, so if you ask one now, we'll be top of the list. So go for it. This is your moment to ask us, because we take a lot longer when you email us, and we try to be quickly on help desk, but this is going to be the fastest way to get a response from us on any questions you may have. So I would say seize the opportunity. But we have a few other preset questions that came in beforehand, so we'll sort of continue on with those. One of the questions we get a lot, and that came in as well, was on language requirements for your evidence. So obviously the G in GRESB stands for global, and that means that your language might not be English in the country that your asset or fund is in, and you may have evidence supporting your ESG performance that is not in English. That's completely fine. We're very open, obviously, to having different kinds of languages, but we do have validators that validate the language and who speak English. So they need to understand it in some way or another. So what we typically ask you to do, if that's the case, is to use the evidence page. We have a nice little template in the back of the reference guide that you can use as a cover page, and to add a summary of your evidence in English, so that the validators are able to find the information that they need to find in your evidence to verify that what you are stating in your response matches with your evidence, and are able to still understand it without you having to completely translate a document, because that can be very cumbersome and expensive. And that's not what we're trying to do here. We're trying to understand what the evidence is about. So that's the key thing here. So make it as straightforward as possible for the validators to look at your evidence piece and to understand what's going on there, and to be able to find that information. So that's the key takeaway message here. Oh, we see we have a question come in. This is great. I'll do one more of the pre-set questions, and then we'll get to the Q&A questions. So really good to see that come in. Keep going. So one of the other questions we get a lot is on evidence and how it applies to the entity. So if you have a subsidiary to which the evidence applies, can you still use it to submit? Well, that's a great question, and it depends a little bit on how you are structured and how your entity is structured in relation to your subsidiary. If it applies to the subsidiary as a whole, you can use it to submit as evidence pieces. So we are quite flexible. It just needs to be very clear what applies to what and whether it applies to the entity as a whole or to the subsidiary alone. That's important for us to understand. Am I correct there, Aurelian, or anything to add there?
No, that's all clear, Katie. I think you've done a good job of explaining that.
Great. Shall we start with some of those Q&A questions then that came in, Aurelian?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Great. I see Ben's asked, what are the top 3 tips for first-time participants? Well, Ben, that's talking about starting with an easy question. That's quite a big one. There are a lot of things we typically advise. So first of all is to start off easy, you know, like take a look at our documents. That we have a lot of resources available online in terms of, we have a really extensive reference guide, which may seem a little daunting, but does kind of contain everything you need in order to start your assessments. We have training platform that you can use to dive in, and there are lots of different trainings. So we have introduction trainings on what are the assessments, how are they structured, as well as more in-depth trainings on specific indicators or aspects. So there's a lot going on there, a lot of information there. So I would recommend starting with that because that will give you at least an overview of what's going on and the lay of the land. I think another thing we recommend to first-time participants is to focus on things that you know already. So if you're starting off in GRESB, you probably already are doing some ESG-related work. So focus on the things that you're already doing and try to focus on that. So for example, if you're already collecting data on energy, start with those indicators. You don't need to get a perfect score in the first year. We don't see that happen ever. So don't worry about, you know, getting 100. Nobody gets that. And your investors are not going to expect that either, realistically. But start to set yourself up on the journey. Don't bite off too much. Focus on the things you already kind of know, what you can do, and build on that. So that would be a big tip. And then afterwards, when you get your results out in the fall, use those to sort of power your ESG journey. So there might be things in GRESB that you're not doing already. So take a moment to see whether that's something you want to start integrating into your processes. So for example, if you find yourself reporting on air pollution in GRESB, but you're not really doing a lot in terms of stakeholder reporting internally, well, maybe this is a great time to start thinking about that and start thinking about how to integrate that into your processes. So that's the kind of stuff we would recommend, at least on my side. Regan, do you have any other recommendations for first-timers?
Sure, I would definitely think, as you said, Katie, that number one is definitely getting familiar with our resources. So as Katie mentioned, we've got a plethora of resources available, and the trainings are definitely a plus, especially for first-time participants. The second is definitely focus on what is material and what you already have. It's likely that there's going to be gaps and weaknesses, but the aim is for you to tackle what you already have in place as best as possible. And then, as said, ESG is a journey. So don't try to get necessarily, well, obviously aim for the top. I'm all for aiming for the top. But of course, be also realistic in your expectations. Number three, maybe from me, is that there's also additional services that are available, and notably called the response check. And essentially, the response check is a service whereby somebody reviews your current answers before the assessment closes. And it is a service that is available, and that is typically used also by first participants who just need an extra little help to make sure that they are proceeding correctly. So that's it for me. That would be my top three, at least.
That's also a good shout. You know, we do offer a lot of options to help you with stuff, and our help desk is really good. I mean, you know, preaching to the converted a little bit here, but obviously we try to answer any questions that come in as quickly as possible. We have a sort of 2 working day roughly a response time, depending a little bit. If it's a very complex question, it might take us a little longer because sometimes we have to talk internally and try to understand your question a little bit better before we're able to give you a response. But we do try to turn those around very quickly if we can. So that's I think a really good one to remember, and to really utilize the resource. And let us know if if you're a first timer and you find something really difficult, share it with us, because we always try to improve our resources and we try to make the experience as straightforward as possible. So we're always open to feedback, and if you have specific thoughts or ideas, and do share them with us. We're a by the industry for the industry initiative, so utilize that, leverage that. So that's another one. So I hope that answers your question, Ben, and gives you at least a little thing to start off on. So good luck, and do get in touch if you have any trouble. Okay, we have another question from an anonymous attendee. Can you explain how the scoring works if a material issue is not relevant? Do the points get spread across the questions related to relevant issues? I think that one's right up Aurelian's alley, because he is our materiality expert. So Aurelian, do you want to take that one?
Sure, thanks, Katie. Yeah, so thanks for your question. So yeah, the way materiality works in our assessment, it's quite complex, so I won't necessarily give a whole presentation around it. We have a specific materiality training on this available. But essentially, just to cut to the chase, is that materiality is driven by several factors in our assessment, and we have 4 different types of outcomes, depending on factors which are, for instance, your sector allocation, the geography, so your primary location, the number of employees, number of contractors, and other several questions what I find in the reporting characteristics, number 7, so RC7. But essentially, there are 4 types of outcomes, and these are no relevance, low relevance, medium relevance, and high relevance for all the ESG issues we cover. So around 46, if I remember correctly. And these issues are, and their materiality outcomes and the drivers for these outcomes are reviewed each year by our governance groups. So the industry benchmark committee, and even to some extent, investor advisory board, so the IAB. So if, for instance, an issue, if you have an outcome, so these outcomes are obviously disclosed in the assessment, and we also have a scoring and materiality tool available if you already want to have a look at which issues are likely to be material for you before the assessment opens. It could be that you disagree with the relevance of an issue. So for instance, if we take waste and your gas pipeline, you may say that waste is not relevant to you, or you disagree with the fact that it's of medium relevance or low relevance. Now, if you disagree with this, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do this year to change that, because it has been reviewed and it is set in stone. However, if you have arguments and justifications to change that materiality, then in that case, you can use our GRESB materiality scoring tool and our fresh desk platform. And there's a feedback process in place so that we review your arguments and justifications, and these will be taken for review by ourselves, but also the IBC. So there's some flexibility there, but it's likely to change for the year 2022 if anything happens. Now, if a material issue is of no relevance, so the outcome is of no relevance or low relevance, then the weighting is of 0. So that's an important consideration to take in place. So that means that some indicators, notably in the performance component, for instance, let's take air pollution for a wind farm. So the outcome of this issue is of no relevance. Then the max score for air pollution will be 0. You won't have to report on it. So for low relevance issues, it's the same. The max score would be 0. The only distinction is that low relevance issue could be material in some way, or maybe investors may be interested in this information, or maybe you do collect it. So feel free to share if you want to share it, or if you want to go for best practice, but it's simply that we don't require you to report on it, and you won't be scored on it. So hopefully that answers your question to some extent, but of course, feel free to come back to us if you have a more specific question that I haven't answered in relation to that.
Yeah, and it's maybe good to add there as well that the question, the points sort of for the performance component are a certain amount. There are 60 points that you can get, and those shift depending on how many of those indicators are material to you. So if you have a few indicators that are material, then the points get allocated accordingly. So the weight moves around a little bit. So that's maybe, I think, the question. So that's actually quite unique about GRESB, because it means that you get a very tailored score in terms of what is really material and really relevant to you as an entity, and therefore sort of helps you focus on those things. So every performance score in a way is very unique, and every assessment is very unique, which is really amazing, I think, in terms of, if you look at other ESG frameworks, it's quite unique. So utilize that, focus on the things that matter, because that's really what sustainability is about as well. So make sure you use that attention in the right way. So great, that's a really great question. I think we have another question on health and safety, also from an anonymous attendee. The measures seem to be lagging indicators. If we don't have targets for these measures, can we explain why? In the past, we have left these blank or put 0 but received no points. So these are the indicators in the health and safety aspect, and indeed they are lagging indicators. So what we do in GRESB is we try to align to external frameworks that are really important in a certain on a certain topic. So we align to the GHG protocol for greenhouse gas emissions, and we align to sort of leading health and safety measures on the health and safety indicators. So yeah, at the moment, a lot of those are lagging. We are very open to changing that in the future, though. So if you have strong views on adding other indicators that you think are really important, please share that with us. We might do that in the future, like I said. So that depends a little bit on our governance groups as well, though. But if you don't have targets for those, you will be given 0 points. We can't make exceptions for that. It's the same for everyone who's participating in the assessment. A lot of those, I think, will be intuitive. So, for example, we have a metric on fatalities. For most people, that will be, 0 in year and 0 as targets. That's very straightforward. And for the others, it might be, depending on your industry, there might be certain benchmarks that you use to compare against. So you can use those as targets as well, as long as you actually use that as a target in your processes internally. So and add that detail to the context box. Yeah, essentially we're very open to any new ideas. So if you have a specific thought, like a metric that you think is really relevant, then do share that with us. For example, last year I think we added near miss incidents as a new metric. So we are open to adding things. We don't want to make it too burdensome. We want to focus on the most important ones, but if there's a good reason to add a more proactive metric, then we're very open to it. So I hope that answers the question. So I think that was now done. And then we have a question from Jonas Lose. In LE6, can a fund's investment analyst be counted in ESG performance targets if they work closely with the asset? Is that one you can take early? Because I'm not entirely sure on this.
Yeah, so I was looking at it, I'm not too sure. I don't think we have LE6 anymore in our fund assessment, so apologies if I'm wrong.
No, this relates to the asset assessment, but it's the funds analysts that work on the asset.
Okay, I see. I misunderstood the question. My bad. It's a good question. I'm not sure exactly of the exact requirements for this, so maybe it's best if we get back to you in relation to that. But typically, I just need to double check on the exact question. So maybe let's get back to you in a bit, John. I'll just check exactly the question.
Yeah, you want to check that in the background, Aurelian, and we have another preset question. So maybe we take that one and then maybe come back to Jonas's question in a bit, if that's all right. And in the meantime, if there's other Q&A questions that have come in that you want to ask, take your opportunity. This is the moment. So as Aurelian looks this up, we'll go to the next one, which is on performance data. So one question we got a few times is on the impact of COVID-19 on your performance data. So one of the questions we got was, will the impact of COVID-19 on my quantitative performance data be taken into account in scoring? Well, at the moment, the asset assessment doesn't take into account performance itself. So we ask you to disclose your data but we don't actually look at how large a number you're reporting or whether it compares very strangely to last year. We will get in touch with you if we think there are outliers, so it might have an impact on your on the engagement that we have with you later in the reporting. I'll get to that in a second. But in terms of actual scoring, it doesn't really affect things at the moment. So this is good to bear in mind. It's different for real estate where that is the case. We're not at that point in infrastructure just yet. We are trying to get there in the future. But if that happens, so if we say do that in future years, we will obviously bear that in mind when we look at this year, because we understand that if you, for example, an airport, it might have been that you have very few people coming into your airport. You may have closed off parts. You may have been forced to close parts as well. So having lower consumption numbers or lower revenue or other intensity figures that might affect your performance will be taken into account in that sense. But we are aiming to do another outlier outreach. So if you participated last year, you might remember that you might have gotten a message from us. On that, we will do some outreach with looking at our data. So we analyze the data that's coming over the reporting season, and we reach out to you before the submission deadline. If we think there's maybe something wrong, or if it looks a little out of the ordinary, if it's very high compared to your peers, or if there's something else that looks a little funny. So we might get in touch with you at that stage. And that might be because of COVID, and that's completely fine, obviously. Like this is just to make sure that you're reporting accurate data and that you have an excellently reported leaders instead of mega leaders. This happens sometimes. So that kind of stuff is what we kind of try to help you with. And if that's the case, it's a very valid reason, and you can add that to the context box as well. So say it's the case that you have very low energy consumption, you can use the little text box below your indicator to add that detail to you, so your investors don't go, wait, why is the energy consumption so low this year? What's going on? You can just be like, it's because of COVID, we had to shut down one of our buildings, so energy consumption is very low. So use that basically also for other things. So hopefully that will answer the question on the quantitative performance data in COVID. Another question that we get a lot and that we thought would be good to address is on certifications versus management systems. So a question we get a lot is that why doesn't GRESB accept ISO as an ESG certification under CA1 certifications in the performance component? You just take a quick sip of water. So we have a certifications indicator in the performance component where we ask you to report any ESG certification that applies to the asset. So this can be LEED or BREEAM. But we do not accept ISO under there. And the reason for that is that we also have a risk management indicator in the management component that covers risk management processes related to ESG. So ISO is typically, it's a management tool, right? It's a certification that you have certain management processes in place, like you have 9001 is a very familiar one, 14001. These are certifications that you have a process that, tackles environmental management, make sure that you have a quality process in place. So that's much more about the functioning of the asset than actually the characteristics of the asset itself. So you're very welcome to report your ISO certifications under the risk management indicator, but not under the certifications, because that would be a duplicate. And we do consider them as very distinct. So that's the main reason for that. And it's a little confusing because everyone uses certification when it comes to ISO, so it feels a bit counterintuitive that you can report that under the certifications indicator, but that's just the way we do it. So you will get points for it just somewhere else, if that makes sense. And so the certifications one is really about, the characteristics of the asset, as I said. So look up some of the certifications that we have listed. It's a fairly comprehensive list. If there is a certification that you have, but that's not in there, we're always open to adding it. So contact our help desk, let us know, provide us with some information. There's a process for that as well that you can follow, and we'll take it into account if it comes in before we start validation, because after that we can't really take new certifications into account anymore, because that would be a bit difficult. So utilize that. Reading, how's it going? Have you been able to track down that LE6 question?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jonas. Thanks for bearing with us, Jonas. Appreciate it. Yeah, so just to reiterate the exact question, so indeed it's in the asset assessment under early 6, and the question itself is, does the entity include ESG factors in the annual performance targets of personnel? And then essentially we have two checkboxes, and one of them is about whether there's financial consequences or non-financial consequences, and then a list of different personnel. So Jonah, sorry, to answer your question, essentially, yes, the fund investments analyst, even if they're not in the checkboxes, you can add them under the other option, but please make sure that their performance is directly related to meeting the targets of the asset itself. So that's the very important distinction. So you can put these stakeholders down, but yeah, as long as indeed it's their performance or the financial consequences or non-financial consequences are related to the ESG performance targets of the asset in question. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Jonas.
I know it answers my question, so I thought that was quite clear. Thanks, thanks, Aurelian. We're kind of gone through most of the pre-prepared questions, so I'd really encourage anyone who's joined to ask any more questions on the Q&A session using the Q&A function, so that we can address them, because that's the whole point of this session, is we want it to be interactive. So anything that's top of your mind that you're not sure about, please shoot it our way and we'll take a look. Because we don't really, we can talk a little bit more about the resources perhaps. Great, Jonas, that's good to know. We can talk a little bit more about the resources, but otherwise we don't have a lot of preset questions. Eric, do you guys have anything you want to add here? Do you think anything that might be helpful for participants recurring this year, perhaps, that we can add?
I was thinking maybe we could get Eric to present a bit of a resilience model integration potentially, but what are your thoughts, Katie?
I'd be very interested to hear that if Eric is keen as well, please.
Yeah, I can go ahead and give some context into our process of over the 3 years of the resilience module and our thinking around integrating it into the core assessments on the infrastructure side. I guess there's three major points that we wanted to be sure to consider during this integration exercise. The first is so the first is that we are integrating it, and so there's been some questions around that. But the resilience module was always framed as a 3-year life cycle, at which at the end of that, our most evolved and sophisticated indicators would be integrated into the core assessments. And so, we're going to follow through with that instead of continuing on the separate module. So in 2021, there will no longer be a separate resilience module, but rather only these couple indicators will be modified in the core assessments, along with the 5 new indicators in the risk management section. The second is that we were really prioritizing assessment stability. So what do we mean by this? The first is that we tried to minimize the number of new indicators that our participants would have to fill out to kind of minimize on extra reporting burden. And the second is that the style of the indicators themselves are very aligned with what is already very familiar to our participants, in terms of the flow of the checkboxes, making the answer choices as easy to understand as possible. And then if you have any questions on that, we have a lot of guidance in the reference guides, so you can understand each of the option choices and what they mean in the context of infrastructure, as opposed to corporates or real estate and things like this. And then the third major thing that we were thinking of during the integration process was, again, as Katie had mentioned, the alignment with the TCFD. So not only were we targeting to address each of the 4 pillars of the TCFD, but actually address each of the 11 recommended disclosures that are spread out across those 4 pillars. And so we actually were able to go ahead and do that in a way that would be useful and insightful to the real asset industry, and not just, for instance, copying the TCFD recommendations right into the report, because that's 11 indicators that aren't necessarily tailored and wouldn't provide the type of value that we're trying to provide to both our participants and our investors. So those are the three major things. In terms of scope of what we've decided to move over from our resilience module into the core assessments. The first was this question of, okay, should it be with regard to resilience in general, or perhaps maybe only climate related resilience? And over the course of the module, it's been quite clear to us that the interest stems from the interest in climate related resilience, and there just aren't kind of the frameworks in place, the common vocabulary in order to conceptualize all of the different types of risks for all different kind of categories. So whether it's geopolitical risk or cybersecurity risk, or in this case, social risk came up as a kind of a problem child, simply because there were no kind of widely agreed upon frameworks and an understanding of what that means. So essentially, garbage in, garbage out. If there's not a clear definition of something like, say, transition risk and physical risk, which are very well defined as per the TCFD, then things like social risk became a catch-all for basically any other type of risk that might occur or might occur in the future. And so essentially, as a validator and a steward and a benchmarker of data, that data became very difficult to handle, and then also not very useful back to its audiences. And so it's been scoped down essentially to climate-related risk and resilience to be able to handle those. Again, it's worth reiterating that the 5 new indicators in the risk management section will not be scored in 2021. The intent is to go ahead and start scoring these in 2022 and onward. But essentially, only about 25-ish% of infrastructure participants participated in the 2020 resilience module. So that still leaves 3/4 of our infrastructure participants who have not yet seen these indicators yet or anything like them. So we're going to go ahead and give them 1 year in order to basically get familiar with those and understand how they might go about putting in processes and strategies in place to be able to score well on those next year. In terms of resources, again, as Aurelian had said, we have a great set of training exercises and materials, videos to go ahead and help you on your assessment journey. So we have one specifically on the integration of the resilience module and basically how to work through step by step each of these new indicators. And then finally, this week we're actually releasing a series of insights posts on our website that specifically, it's called the Resilience Insights Series, and it both combines kind of some high level data points from our 2022 resilience module results, while also pairing that with some expert commentary on some topics and elements around the concept of resilience and climate risk. So we think that will be helpful in conceptualizing and understanding kind of where these indicators are coming from and why we think they're useful for our investors. Any heads up to what the new module will be?
That's
back over to you, Katie. Thanks.
Thanks, Eric. That was very insightful, and yeah, highly recommend checking out those Insight articles when they come out. Also to start a dialogue, really, right, Eric? Because what we're really trying to do this year as well is to see what responses we get on the resilience questions that are now integrated into the management components, and to see how participants have taken that on, and to use that also for next year. So that's the more engagement, the better, I think, at this stage. But that's maybe also GRESB's motto: more engagement is better. So great. So we've got some really great questions in. Any heads up as to what the next new module will be? Anonymous attendee has asked. Well, that's a very big question. And I can't really promise you what that is going to be. We have a few things that we're working on at the moment, but at this stage, it might be better to just hand to Aurelian because he's one of the masterminds on the new thing that we might be adding in the future. So Aurelian, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, great, thank you, Katie. So sure, as Katie said, not completely confirmed yet, but the next new module may be something in relation to EU regulations. So as some of you may be aware of, the EU regulations have come in, and so level 1 disclosures came out on the 10th of March for at least our European participants. So what are EU regulations? So typically GRESB is looking at the SFDR regulations, so the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations, as well as EU taxonomy. But lately we've been particularly focused on the principal adverse impact statements that are relatable to our participants, and notably at product level. So we're pretty active on this space. I myself am the product leader for this product, so anything EU regulations related, feel free to reach out to me. But we also have a series of resources available on our website. So we have a dedicated webpage on SFDR, and obviously we're monitoring very closely any sort of updates in relation to that from the European Commission and other relevant bodies. So we also have a mapping available on the principal adverse impacts. So yeah, sorry, new regulations. So these are primarily relevant to our European participants. So SFDR stands for the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, and the principal adverse impacts are just one element of this regulation that came out. But there's a lot of information online. But as I said, we also have a dedicated section on our website in relation to that. We also have an alignment for principal adverse impacts document that is available with the latest iteration that came out from February, so the final draft that came out. So that may very well be potentially the new module that comes out. But we are obviously looking at other areas, and yeah, we'll let you know. Follow our newsletter, and you'll be on top of everything we're doing.
Great, brilliant, thanks. Yeah, and so watch that space. I think Rick has just shared some links to our web pages on SFDR. And as Aurelian said, you know, we are working on it at the moment. So if you have any insights or thoughts, please share them with him. And I realize this is obviously also a session where we have a lot of our participants in Asia Pacific on the call. It might be more or less relevant to you. We're trying to figure out how we can make sure that we have this regional thing that is currently quite EU focused, but will probably be something that is, we envision this going across multiple jurisdictions, and that's why we flagged it as an important thing for our participants and our investors. So that's why we're working on it. So we're trying to make sure that it won't be just something like, okay, this is nice for the Europeans and everyone else can ignore it. We're trying to make this useful for everyone. So don't worry too much about that for now. Great. I think we've got quite a number of questions. We have one on the next webinar, Q&A webinar. Watch the space. We might organize another one if there is indeed some interest, and we might organize one during the assessment period. Yeah, so we'll keep you posted, and we'll share the newsletters, etc. if that does materialize. If there are no other Q&A questions coming in, then I think it's great if we can sort of wrap up by talking a bit more about some of those resources that we've mentioned throughout the session, just so you definitely know where to find everything, because that's really important. So as I said, we have lots of documents available to you on our web pages. Everything in the portal, everything we have in terms of guidance is freely available. So it's whether you are already participating or not yet, if you want to get familiar with GRESB, you can just find everything you need. It's there. Our scoring documents, our reference guides, indicator summaries. We have the assessments in Excel format as well. So if you just want to play around a little bit with it just on your computer, and you just have the Excel to sort of put your numbers in and to see how that comes out, we have that. We have the materiality and scoring tool. We have a sector location matrix that you can use to understand how different characteristics for your entity, what that will mean for your reporting. So that's all freely available. So you can find that at documents.gresb.com and at gresb.com/resources. We try to have it everywhere, so you can definitely find it somewhere. And obviously all of this is available in the portal as well. So if you're going through the assessment, there'll be a little button with all the references there. So you can, per indicator, see exactly what applies to that specific indicator. So we invite you to just take a look. And again, if you have any feedback on any of the materials that we provide, please share it with us. We want to make this as easily accessible as possible. So if you have thoughts on that, we're always happy to help and to hear from you. So that's it in terms of documents. We have a training platform, as we mentioned. So this we introduced this last year because we thought we wanted to be more sustainable and do fewer in-person trainings. Well, that was someone, the person who came up with that definitely deserves an award because that was very good timing. So we have an entirely online training platform that you can freely access. You don't have to pay for anything, it's all there. There are lots of lessons going on. So as I said, we have things from starting off with how do I open a GRESB assessment? How do I make fund asset links? How do I give people access to who can see my results? What is the scoring about? As to specific questions on the indicators. So how do I complete the performance component? How do I tackle the risk management indicators, etc. So it's very thorough. So obviously you don't have to do everything, you can pick a mix. And again, if you have any feedback on our training, please share it with us. So it's our second year this year, so we're still improving, still working on it. So we always welcome feedback if you have it. And that's available on our website as well at gresb.com/courses. And then obviously you want to go to the 2021 GRESB Infrastructure Assessment Training because that's where all the infrastructure trainings are. And finally, if you really can't figure it out and you really need help, we have a help desk. You can contact us through a forum. It's available at gresb.com/contact. It's also accessible in the portal. So if you go into the portal and you have a question straight away, you can contact us. Please provide your details and your question, and we'll make sure it ends up with a person who's best placed to answer your question. So we always ask people to, if they have questions on the assessments, to use this form rather than trying calling us or emailing us directly, because it may be that your question is something that a specific person has a lot of expertise on, and this way we can make sure it goes straight to that person. Whereas if you email me and I'm on holiday, it might take a while before I get back to you. So that's not really ideal if you just want to get something sorted out, right? So please use the contact form when you get the best placed person to respond to you. And also, if you have any feedback or any questions on other things, you can always contact our help desk and we'll try to get back to you as soon as we can. I don't see any more Q&A questions coming in, so I think if you have no other questions at this rate, we should wrap it up. But as I said, you know, feel free to get in touch whenever you want to. Thank you very much for attending today. I hope it was very helpful. I hope you were able to ask us all of those tricky questions that you weren't sure about. Wishing you the best of luck with your reporting, and hope to see many of you get good results at the end of the season. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.